Welcome, everybody. This is the locally led webinar for Soil and Water Conservation District Supervisors. My name is Leanne Buck, and this is the locally led webinar for Soil and Water Conservation District Supervisors. And this webinar is designed to provide you with the information and tips for your leadership role. And you guys do have a key leadership role with local working groups and community engagement. So you're going to hear a couple terms tossed around this morning. And again, the local working group process is a formal means facilitated by the SWCD to identify resource concerns and provide input directly to USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. And again, this is a national effort. Every soil and water district across the country has a role with local working groups. And also, though, what we did want to focus to, besides the local working group process, we are also referring to locally led. In a nutshell, we're talking about your important role as a citizen board member. As an SWCD supervisor, and I know we have a few staff on the line as well that support the supervisors, you are entrusted with some of Minnesota's most precious assets, our natural resources. And part of that leadership role includes the what part of your job, and that means articulating your local priorities, your needs, but also then we also acknowledge the how part of your job with facilitating, representing, and also engaging your community in natural resource protection and restoration. So I do want to say thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. And at this time, I'd like to segue to Keith Klobeck with the NRCS, and he'll walk through the agenda with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Leanne. And on behalf of Minnesota NRCS, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Keith Klobeck. I'm the Assistant State Conservationist for Programs. That's a mouthful, out of St. Paul. We all have pretty long titles, but so I work on our conservation programs from easements, EQIP, CSP, and that involves a lot of our other planning outreach efforts locally led. So that's why I'm here with you today. So thank you. And we'll move through the agenda items today and then the slides to get you up to speed. So this locally led Conservation 2 training series is brought to you by NRCS MESWCD, represented by Leanne and I, and then U of M Extension with Lisa Hines, and Leadership Tools with Donna Ray. So thank you to the three of them for the assistance with putting on this conservation series, building off the one that we conducted 3 years ago. Next slide. So really the goal of this locally led conservation series and today's is to provide you the information and some tips along with the leadership roles like Leanne mentioned, and some information on hopefully improving your local working group process with community engagement outreach, and also just kind of an overview of the locally led process as a refresher. Next slide. So the agenda today, we will be covering why local led conservation matters. That was one of the big things that came up in the survey we did last fall, of kind of finding value in this locally led process, local and national leadership, the impacts of local working groups and the basics of them, and then broader engagement of the public and our stakeholders, along with your roles as elected officials and the roles of staff, what they play in this process. Making a difference. We're going to cover some things for partnerships and impacts, and then we'll have a closing at the end of it. So with that, we will turn it back to, I think next is Donna Ray, and going to move forward with our next presenter.
Nope, you've got me.
Oh, no, sorry, it's Lisa. We're doing yeah, sorry.
We're doing a quick tour.
No
problem. No problem. Hey, and that's why we do the Zoom room tour. So I know for many of you, this may be a regular kind of thing, and for others, it's a little fresher. This isn't your daily bread in terms of the Zoom room. So I just want to let you know, you will see there's a chat at the bottom of your screen. You have a little icon that kind of looks like a little call out. And you can use that for your comments, your questions. We asked the question, where are you calling from this morning, in the chat, and the number of you jotted in. So that's one way, and you'll see on the screen here a little bit of what the icon looks like and how you connect with it. Then there's also, we know that it's good to be able to hear while you're in here. And so you'll also notice there's a little microphone button. You want to make sure that the speakers are turned on and the volume is up. So we hope you can hear. Of course, if you can't hear me, that would be why we've got it on the screen. It's a good way to let people know that if the audio is not working, they can still access at some level. And then last of all, we are in a very large group here this morning. And so we've set it up so that you are muted, or if you're not right now, we ask that you are, because we're going to move through material. We have a number of speakers this morning. And so that's why we encourage you to use the chat as a way to communicate with us as we go along here. We are recording this morning, and that link will be provided sometime in April. We know there's some folks who registered who weren't able to show up at the last minute, and of course, folks who may not have been able to participate. So with that, then, I'm going to pass to Donna Ray.
Well, thank you. Again, my name is Leanne Buck, and I'm with the Minnesota Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And for this portion of the webinar, we're focusing on why locally led matters. And for those of you that have been around me, I'm always thinking about mission, meaning, and purpose. And this has quite a bit to do with our history. So when I think of our SWCD history, I like to think that the SWCDs, along with our federal partners, NRCS, I like to think of it in terms of we have the same DNA. And what I mean by that is, our roots are vested in implementing federal, state, and local conservation programs, or having a say or helping to carve out how those policies work. But at the same time, we're also trying to recognize that local autonomy. So how does a federal system ingratiate its way into the local community? The attorneys 75 years ago, the USDA attorneys that drafted the SWCD statute that was applicable to every state, said SWCD citizen boards, having that citizen voice, having that local landowner, that local farmer, that local partner be part of the dialogue and discussion is very key. So today we're again highlighting that. So I have the honor and privilege to work with NRCS State Conservationist Troy Daniel all the time. And it's a wonderful opportunity for our organization, as well as NRCS and our Bowser partner, our state partner, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, to continue to look at how we do the delivery of conservation in the state of Minnesota. So for this webinar, we wanted to share our thoughts based on the local work group process and how this impacts all of us collectively. So we'll kick it off. Again, I want to introduce Troy Daniel as the Minnesota State Conservationist. And so Troy, what does the local work group process mean to you?
Well, hi, Leanne, and thank you for having me on today. For me, it's historical. It's 80 plus years of the foundation of our partnership. It goes back to Hugh Hammond Bennett's vision of local conservation. And it's the foundation of what we do every day. It takes information and input from local farmers and stakeholders, leads it through that local leadership of the Soil and Water Conservation District, and then feeds the beast, so to speak, of the USDA, NRCS, and SWCD partnership of putting conservation on the ground with sound technical and financial assistance.
So also, then, Troy, as a state conservationist, you're constantly meeting with different organizations, different individuals, especially leaders of what I would say a variety of organizations, everything from livestock organizations, commodity groups, wildlife organizations, local, state, and federal government officials. So what do leaders of those stakeholder groups, what do they want to know about the local working group process?
Well, quite often it starts with a misinterpretation of the local-led and local work group purpose of being an EQIP program or some type of programmatic issue. But the reality is what I try to turn the conversation into is it's their way as producers, as stakeholders, to provide input to not only financial assistance programs, but most importantly, our technical assistance, and help us determine what the local community need. It could be economic, cultural, social aspects. All those things tie into local-led conservation. And so my message typically to those stakeholders at the state level or even national level is I rely heavily on that input from the local producers. It's good to hear from national and larger groups and their perspective, maybe an industry perspective, but most important, what does the local community need? What are their resource concerns? Is the wind erosion in their part of the world the big issue? Is it soil health? Is it that we need more technical assistance for our farmers to implement precision ag? So that's usually my message is it's broad based and it's truly what does that local community need?
I appreciate that so much. And again, mission, meaning, purpose, it all falls together. Another thing, kind of a segue or build upon what you just said, I think it was just even 2 weeks ago, our board of directors, the State Association for Soil and Water Districts met, and we had you and your staff were there to talk about the NRCS, for example, the state health, soil health strategy. And one of the things in that strategy, there were references to the local working groups. And then I think of another example where you and I were talking and you had mentioned that a landowner had raised a concern on a specific issue. And one of the first things you did after you had that phone call with that individual, you went back and looked up what was in that local resource concerns identified at that field office level. So as you get these variety of things or examples, can you maybe share the big picture perspective of how NRCS really does refer to these outcomes? And this goes beyond just, again, I think you mentioned it, it has a big influence on a lot of your agency activities and not just a programmatic effort.
Yeah, I use that personally, and you talked about referencing local resource needs and local priorities. I reference that as much as even this morning, talking to a couple of my staff about CSP and how we're going to guide that next year in our conservation stewardship program. And the first words out of my mouth is we need to wait till we start hearing from these local work groups this year, and we can start driving how we're going to run the program next year for CSP stewardship. But also another example, the last couple of years, I've heard from various local work groups and SWCDs, other partners, producers. We need more technical assistance in the agronomy world, precision ag. We need more technical assistance with grazing. So we made a slight change to our org chart. And this year we're onboarding brand new, just as recently as this week, grazing specialists. We're about to start hiring some agronomists. Those little things, it seems small, but those are the things that drive the technical assistance of the future. And to me, the measurement, the outcome, am I meeting what the request is? We can't always. I mean, there's some things that are out of our scope, out of our authority, beyond NRCS that we just don't do or can't do. But anywhere we can, I like to listen to what the local folks want and then try to implement that. And the ultimate goal, the ultimate outcome, are we getting cleaner water? Are we getting cleaner air? And are we measuring improvements on our grazing lands and our forest lands? So it's a big piece. It drives the technical assistance side just as much as anything.
Wow. And again, the full picture, it does make a difference. One of the things too, then, as we segue for our association, this webinar offerings that we've had now today with supervisors, the local elected officials, but also previous to this, we included the NRCS and SWCD staff. So we not only highlighted the local working group process, but we also are referencing it as locally led. And so for our association, one of our forums to provide locally led policy input is through our resolution process. And sometimes we take those kind of ongoing annual processes, we might take it for granted. But I want to use an example. Last year we had a resolution and it came from, I believe, the Chippewa Soil and Water Conservation District. And it was pertaining to modifications to the EQIP program, for example, but it also had therefore be it resolved. And it did reference, consideration, for example, looking at your 4 regional areas for ranking. And again, these resource concerns. So what I'm getting at is, for me as an association executive, words matter, and articulating what you need. I always think groupthink is hard. So the more we can get it into writing or document it is helpful. And I think that goes either way for the local working group process and, or for example, our resolution process and the One Watershed, One Plan for that civic engagement that's included with that as well. So I'm just wondering, would you be able to comment on how, for example, like even our resolution process or these local working groups having the important role of articulating and documenting resource concerns are helpful to both of us, both of our organizations, to you in leading the federal, farm bill programs and activities and your staffing, as well as, from our organization?
That's I'll try to answer that the best I can. That key note that you said, locally led, and to me, the Soil and Water Conservation District board leaders, they're not just board members, they're leaders. They're leaders in their community. They represent a segment of their county quite often. Some parts of the country, they represent pieces of a watershed. So they're part of their leadership responsibility is gathering input from their local constituents and then packaging that up. And like you said, articulating that message out and trying to actually solve the problem. And sometimes it's a challenge. That's something that we as a agency do not want to dictate directly to the board members. We want them to solve those challenges of how to articulate what the need is internally and then get that message out. And you're right, putting it in writing is imperative. I have a good friend that's still active in the watershed district back home. He's actually on the state board. And Owen Cantrell always says, man, we've got to get this in writing. And then we have to get the writing out to the right people. And that drives policy, that drives future farm bills. That even drives, even though you may seem like Chippewa County is just Chippewa County in Minnesota, some of those things can elevate up beyond me. And I'll take those to our chief, the secretary, undersecretary. Sometimes those issues are beyond Minnesota. And that's where the local leadership comes in with the Soil and Water District. Is they are who we recognize as the local leaders of conservation. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. I've seen change. You mentioned resolutions here in Minnesota. Just since I've been here, I think we've tried to make adjustments from a couple of resolutions. Silvopasture is one of them. We made some changes on silvopasture and offering that. We're working on some things with water retention here and offering new practices. So it means something. And if we can do it, I would hope most state cons, including myself, will be responsive to those needs.
Thank you, Troy, because, and again, those resolutions, many of those that we have shared with you, have come to fruition, and they're going to have impacts as we move into the future. And so again, for the Soil and Water District supervisors in the audience, one of the things that we've been advocating quite a bit is NRCS has a great process for the science of natural resources. And they've been able to take and list resource concerns. And one of the things that I think has been highlighted so many times is how do we use the same language for one watershed, one plan when we identify resource concerns, and then translate that over into, hey, here's what we said in our one watershed, one plan, or our county water plan, and how do we articulate those same priorities and move those into that conversation with our local working group process and peers. So again, language does matter, and I just want to articulate and thank you as supervisors for continuing to think about it. Because at the end of the day, I always say, the other thing I always say is groupthink is hard. And so how we can make it easier and your leadership role to help translate and articulate those priority concerns are huge. And also facilitate, just as much as articulating, translating, but facilitating is just as important as well as local leaders. So Troy, kind of as we look at this, one of the things that I know anytime you're a state conservationist, it means you've worked in many parts of the state, including Washington, D.C. So one of the questions I've had is you've worked in different states, in that experience of working with conservation districts across the country, what would you say might be unique about Minnesota's districts? Because I do like to think we're same but different. So what would you say is unique about the Minnesota Soil and Water Conservation Districts?
Well, apart from a language difference, and that's just a joke, but yeah, I think the first thing is I felt like I was not speaking the same English, but in Minnesota, what I noticed right off the bat is I haven't been involved with any districts here that were not robust and engaged. You don't get that everywhere. I mean, that's just, it's sad, but not all districts across America take their role as being that important, and they should. But I think the leadership, and it's historical. I mean, and I haven't been to a district yet where they don't talk a little bit about their history. If a board member pulls me aside, they like to brag about, and they should, things that they've accomplished in the past through local leadership. But I guess being robust and engaged and actually making sure that their voice is heard and that they're engaged in agriculture and conservation here in Minnesota is unique. And I hope Minnesota districts realize that, and I hope they continue that path because it's special. It's very special.
Thank you, Troy. And last but not least, again, as we look at what we're unique about, but we also want to think I'm always about continuous improvement. So what advice do you have for Soil and Water District board members as we continue to do our conservation delivery across Minnesota and work with you and NRCS and your local staff, as well as the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources and a tremendous amount of other partners?
I'd say always be looking to the future there, and but at the same time, don't lose your foundation. You know, we're hearing a lot of buzzwords, and we do from time to time. Seems like every few years there's new buzzwords out there, but you said it yourself, Leanne, it's still conservation. That's what our foundation is. And don't lose touch with our core. For us, it's our ag producers. It's our forestry folks and our farmers, our ranchers. Don't lose touch with that foundation because, man, number one, they need someone on their side. And I think SWCDs have a history of being on the side of the producers and the farmers that feed this world. So I think it's imperative that they keep that link. It helps the farmers, but I think you'll find real quick that the farmers will be on your side too. But don't lose touch with their background and your heritage, but at the same time, be forward thinking. So in some cases, embrace some of the new lingo, but figure out what we can do to help solve those challenges because air quality, I flew to San Diego last year, and yes, 25 years later, San Diego is a lot cleaner than it is today. I'm sure flying into Minneapolis today is a lot cleaner. So air quality, a lot's been done. We have a lot less erosion. There's a lot of positive things that you can talk about with conservation, but there's still a lot to do because we still have water quality issues that need to be solved. They won't solve overnight. It's ongoing. And we really need to do more with our soil health. I think soil health is beneficial to the sustainability of the country, actually. Our food system depends on it, our economic system. So as you hear buzzwords like climate smart ag or whatever the flavor of the day is, know that it's still conservation. And we are set up as a partnership to deal with it. We have the foundation and we have the programs and the technical assistance that can be readily adapted and adjusted. So be forward thinking, but stay close to your roots too.
Thank you, Troy. To build upon that, you know, when I look at the advice for my members, I continually think one of the things is I'm a very future-oriented person and try to be visionary. And recently, several years ago anyway, I had somebody tell me one of the important things we did at our board retreat was to acknowledge those milestones. And I do think it is important to kind of stop, collectively assess, hey, what have we done? Because that helps us sometimes articulate then where we're going. So for the soil and water districts out there to build upon what Troy is saying, look to the future, but it's also take some time, acknowledge that milestone. Maybe once a year you ask your DC and your district manager collectively what has happened in our county. So we have a good understanding of that as we go into these local work group meetings and or as we work with our county commissioners or the citizens in general. So again, I want to say thank you, Troy, for this opportunity to provide a forum for our members and our Solid Water District staff and your NRCS employees with this series of local working groups and locally led conservation. It's been a tremendous opportunity, and sometimes we take what we do for granted, and I don't want our folks to do that. So I think this is a way to take a look and just stop and look at our collective work that we do together, our mission, meaning, and purpose, and move forward as we advance private lands conservation in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne.
And with that, we would now like to know more about you. Hopefully you picked up on the compliment there about engaged and robust SWCDs. And so we now have a poll that we would like you to respond to that should appear on your screen in just a minute. And we're just curious to know, those in the house today, how long have you served as an SWCD supervisor? And you just click on your category there, and we'll keep this open for a short amount of time, and then we will show you who is bringing both their expertise as well as some fresh perspectives into their role as a supervisor. So with that, it looks like maybe we can show the results of that. Just about many of you are in. You can think to yourself, which of those categories do you think will be highest today? So there you have it. We have fewer than 4 years. And as you also many in the House, 4 to 12, and then more with 12 or more years of expertise. So thank you, Lisa, for managing that poll. We now have Ian Cunningham with us, and Ian is a Pipestone SWCD member, former MASWCD state board member, and now is second vice president for the National Association of Conservation Districts. And Ian, it's not everyone who gets introduced with a picture of marble cake, but as Leanne had said, 80 years ago, the legislation put for conservation a marble cake with federal, state, and local leadership swirling together. And that was to be different than a layer cake where somebody was on top and somebody was on the bottom. So I think you've lived out leadership in all these local, state, and federal. So again, second part of why local matters. And we also have Leanne Buck then to continue the conversation with Ian. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you, Donna Ray. As we transition, I just want to say I've had the honor and privilege with working with so many supervisors across our state. And Ian, as a past president, it was a joy to work with him. So what we wanted to do to segue to is kind of have that real life example of an SWCD official. So Ian, what does the local working group process mean to you?
Well, Leanne, I guess I would like to maybe build on the marble cake, layer cake concept. You know, when it comes to conservation delivery, a lot of people and people that I've met in Washington, D.C. that maybe are not very close to conservation delivery. In government, they perceive the people at the top being the President of the United States, members of Congress, governors and legislators, and perhaps the Secretary of Agriculture, the Undersecretary for Production and Conservation, state conservationist. And when you get all the way to the bottom, you have soil water conservation districts. And there's each of us may individually not have as much power as those people that were higher up that organizational chain. But there are 3,000 SWCDs in the nation, and nearly 17,000 men and women serve on their boards. And they represent not everyone. Really, the only ones that care about natural resource conservation is people who can eat food and consume water and breathe air. So when you're setting up your local work group, you don't need to go out to the cemetery because we don't look for those opinions of the people that are resting out there. But when you think of it as a building, the foundation of the building, the 17,000 men and women who are serving as district officials, have more power collectively to influence those up the line because they are the foundation of the building. And the foundation of the building is more important than the blinking red light that is on top of the building, or the view from a penthouse or from an airplane window, where you maybe see a lot of stuff, but you don't see any of the details. You're detached. So the importance of being able to leverage this federal engagement is important from a standpoint that when the local voices speak all the way up the line, that voice matters.
Well, thank you, Ian. A couple other questions. And again, do you have any examples of how those local priorities had an impact at a national level, for example?
Well, and Troy just made a point that, there are sometimes things come out of local work groups and filter up to the state technical committee that have national implications. But the important thing to remember about local work groups and locally led is that it is local, and that we have the opportunity to prioritize the federal funding at the local level, realizing that all these 3,000 conservation districts have different resource concerns and different opportunities to make positive impacts. So while I can't point to a single initiative that has risen up to the national level, the important thing is that we have locally led voluntary conservation, and that's the foundation of what we do. And we work with our cooperators, which, as Troy pointed out, while our constituents are everyone, and we are a conservation unit of government and not an agriculture unit of government, our greatest opportunities still lie in the ground that produces annual and perennial crops, grazing land, and non-federal forestry.
And for the last question, Ian, because we will be soon getting into the mechanics of how the process works, but what advice do you have for an SWCD board members who are participating in the local work group meetings?
Well, we need to remember that where we all started, back in the 30s and prior to the 30s, there was a guy named Hugh Hammond Bennett, and he noticed that some ground was not as productive as it used to be. And he went to his superiors at the Department of Federal Government that conservation was under at the time, and said, I think we have something we need to look at here. So he was rewarded by being transferred to Alaska or South America, where there was a revolution going on. And the USDA issued a statement saying the soil is the one thing that will always be the same. It is immutable. You can't wear it out. And then when the Dust Bowl came along, they says, "Well, where is that guy that said we need to take care of our soil?" And they created the Soil Erosion Service. And their idea was to have demonstration farms across the country showing these practices. And it was a failure because the local people that they wanted to influence were not impressed by a farm that was being run by hired hands, federal hired hands that maybe didn't work weekends and nights and holidays like farmers do. The orders were coming from a central location, not realizing the local conditions. So the President Roosevelt at the time sent out a uniform act to all the governors to create soil and water conservation districts. So we would have that local buy-in to create the local priorities. And only then could the Federal Soil Erosion Service, which became the Soil Conservation Service, which became NRCS, could have a presence in that county. So it's important for us to take seriously our role as providing input from whatever leadership of any stakeholders we can involve. It's the local work group's a public meeting. We have an opportunity to have people sit on the local work group that will vote if we need to have a vote on what gets points. So we need to take this seriously. And if we don't, then decisions will be made without us. And I think it's very important that if we're going to maintain locally led voluntary conservation, that we need this local grassroots foundational involvement. Otherwise, the decisions about resource conservation will be made on those higher floors of this conservation delivery building.
Thank you so much, Ian. I appreciate it. And now we will segue back to our facilitators and take it away.
Thank you so much, Ian, and we're proud to have Minnesota represented on that state board. So we've now moving to Keith, who did introductory comments, who is the head of programs and has done remarkable things to refresh the local working group and also be transparent about it. So Keith, welcome, and you can put some definitions to some of these words for folks who are unfamiliar.
Yes, thank you, Leanne. I mean, thank you, Donna Ray, and thank you, Leanne, for the transition and the introduction. And so what I'm going to cover today is, and it's pretty timely based on the survey, is a little bit of the local working group and locally led basics and then impacts. So the survey that we had last fall that went out to staff and supervisors really helped us develop this agenda and focus our efforts. And a couple of the big things that became apparent in that is that some staff and supervisors, partners were having trouble finding the value of the locally led process and also an understanding of that local work group process, who should be doing what it means, where it goes. So those are a few of the things that I'm going to cover today to hopefully clarify that and build on what Troy, Ian, Leanne, others have said and will say today to show kind of the big impact that it has and why our participation really does make a difference. And the more we put into it, the more we're going to get out of it. So the big thing is that, as we mentioned the terms, this locally led is really the big terminology, is more than just local working groups. So in locally led, part of that is that local working group process, but it's also this continual process that goes more than just that meeting. It goes all year long, where we're continually looking at ways to gather input, evaluate what the needs are, identify additional needs and partners, and then it involves really that community of stakeholders and other processes out there. And so it's not just that one time a year meeting and then we walk away from locally led. That local working group is just one part of this overall process. So we wanted to make that clear and just hopefully show the value in the system that we're looking at using for locally led. So what is locally led? I think that's one of the things, the terms that's a little newer to some. We've always focused on that local working group, but locally led is really just that community of stakeholders doing these following tasks. So one of the big things that we've always done in the past is really assessing our resource conservation needs. So we're all pretty familiar with the resource concern prioritization that we've done in the past, but looking at expanding that as well. We also set some community goals. That's always been part of locally led goals and all of our plans, all of our projects, all of our partnerships, what we hope to get out of it. And then something else that we're really trying to emphasize through this series of trainings is developing an action plan. And I'll get into that a little bit more later, but the actions that are needed to make those locally led ideas and priorities successful. And then building on that is obtaining the resources to carry out that plan. So identifying what's missing, what else could be available out there to help you implement those local needs. Then moving on to implementing solutions, which is the key part of any plan, and then also measuring a success. So where did we end up? Not just the reoccurring locally led process year after year, but what worked last year, what didn't, what were our results, and what are some of the changes that we should be making based on that. So there's really 4 major activities of the locally led process. So this conservation needs assessment, that's something that we're pretty familiar with. We some of the earlier trainings, we gave some resources to staff to help identify additional ways to look at not just the 47 resource concerns NRCS is looking at, but looking at other things like livestock producers, land, sensitive soils, watershed features, different demographics for your county or your local working group area that would all be part of that needs assessment. So trying to build off of that, and then this conservation action plan. So this is really laying out really our targeted timing of when we want these things to occur in our locally led efforts, the priorities, and that's back to the variety of items that we had assessed in that needs assessment, and then the goals and the method of delivery. So as you heard from Troy and others, that it's not always just programs. It's not always the sign up for a contract, sign up for state cost share, sign up for equip. There's a lot of non-programmatic items that we can be doing to help, with the delivery of this, whether it's a field day, whether it's just general technical assistance, whether it's putting together mentoring groups and building off that wisdom that others have shared, partnering with other conservation agencies and grower groups to leverage their information. So it really is all of that. And then looking at what are we missing? If there's something that we've identified and we don't have a process, a program, the technical resources, the trained staff, the outreach efforts to make it successful, what is missing? That's part of that action plan too. And what do we need to develop to then make that plan successful, and through implementing our plan, getting it conducted. So then, the action plan implementation, obviously, once we've identified those items, moving into the implementation of the plan. So what resource concerns we're going to address, what programs, what partners, what processes, who will do what, is a big part of that action plan implementation. And then the thing that we need to come back to too, I think, in everything we do, is the evaluation of results. So it's pretty easy to set our goals and then next year set our goals and prioritize some resource concerns and needs. But how effective were we? What were the outcomes? And if we didn't hit our action plan goals, what changes are needed? Do we need additional training? Are we missing some funding gaps? Are we missing, a producer group that's not engaging, that we can do some targeted outreach to? So I think those are some of the main things that we are looking at through these locally led activities that hopefully can build this process and see it all the way through from start to finish. So this is one of the handouts that you can see on the screen now. It's this that you received in the earlier packet. So if you want to take a look at that or just follow along on the screen, but it's the locally led process. It's this conservation model. And I like this because it shows this continual cycle. It's not just the local working group in the middle. That's it. We conduct that. Next year, we conduct it again. This is that continual process. So it really starts with the gold circle. And actually, it really starts before that. I mean, that's the convening with districts, helping us to convene these local working groups. But it starts with some of the pre-work, some of the planning, some of the outreach, all of these things to make that local working group successful. But it really kind of kicks off with that local working group. Then it moves through that public participation, engaging them in the needs assessment. What other items do the public and our stakeholders and partners think are important? Moving into goals and priorities and goal setting, and then potential funding. And so that's part of that action plan. What do we have out there besides just NRCS and SWCD cost share and programs that we can use to meet our goals and address the local needs that we've identified? We move on to conservation action plan and proposals. So that's implementing that plan, identifying additional needs and going after those, whether it's grants or training or other program offerings, and then implementing it through getting that financial and technical assistance to help implement the plan. So that could be the funding for NRCS programs, SWCD, or it could just be technical assistance with giving them guidance on practice standards, specifications, general information to help implement that plan. And then the key part too is measuring that performance so that we have that information to come back when we start this cycle again and determine did we meet our goals? We had targeted resource concerns X, Y, Z. If we didn't get those identified and addressed last year, what can we tweak to target it better in our next process? So the big question that we asked staff and that I asked, you as supervisors is, did you complete the cycle? So did we start out with that, pre-planning work all the way through, back through implementing the plan and measuring performance? If we didn't, where can we improve that to make this process, to close the loop and make it more meaningful to those involved and make our process better? So one of the things too I just wanted to touch on today was local working group responsibilities. Conservation districts. So this is an NRCS policy, and so we appreciate your assistance with this. It's not something that we make you do. We appreciate the partnership, as we said. This is something that districts, when they're willing to, help us with all of these items listed. You really are helping in most cases to convene and assemble the work group, helping us to conduct it, helping set the agenda. Of course, this goes hand in hand with NRCS assistance. But if the district was not willing to do this or participate, it all falls on us. And then we are going forward alone. So this partnership is key towards us making this successful. We appreciate it at all levels, the field office level all the way up to the state conservationist and beyond, that you're willing to help provide assistance with this process. And you, by joining us today, shows me that you are engaged and willing to assist with the local working group process. So thank you. And then I wanted to just touch on a few slides about local work group impacts. From the sessions and the earlier sessions and the survey last fall, there was really a big focus on NRCS programs, and that is a big part of this, but we're trying to make it, identify these other areas that the local working group and locally led can address. So some of them I mentioned earlier were identifying opportunities or needs for outreach and targeting, conservation practices and scenarios. There's different opportunities through this process to identify practices and scenarios needed to address your local needs. Leanne mentioned the resolution process and some of those things that came forward. We also look at those through the local work group comments. If there's other things that we can bring into next year's program delivery or just general technical assistance practices. Local working groups can also identify training needs. If you have a need for nutrient management planning and you don't have any certified nutrient management planners, that's a concern. Who's going to pick up that workload? Who's going to provide that assistance? Grazing systems for livestock producers are another big item where there's some technical assistance needs in many parts of the state. It can also help direct staffing needs. Do we need additional staff? Do we need targeted staff? And then planning prioritization. Where should we focus our limited efforts or our limited staff and time for planning, doing the outreach, doing the targeting? It also definitely factors into our conservation and program delivery, which I'll get into in upcoming slides, which then impacts our ranking, funding, and implementation of what we're putting out there on the ground. So what happens to your local working group minutes once they're done, your priorities? Hopefully at the local level, you're implementing them, you're using them to shape your programs, your delivery, your outreach. But what happens once they're sent off an email to me, to the state level? I wanted to go through that briefly. So the local working group is really a subcommittee of the State Technical Advisory Committee. And they provide recommendations and input to the state conservationist for all things NRCS. And so your recommendations are compiled. We bring them in front of the State Technical Advisory Committee for discussion. And then those recommendations are put forward to State Conservationist Troy Daniel. And as you heard directly from him, how much he values and prioritizes this local input and this local control. And so the next slide, this is something I created. It's also a handout, so you can see that I'm in conservation, not in graphic design, for a reason. A lot of cutting, pasting, shaping of words and some tweaking, but I wanted just to, for those of you that are more visual like I am, I think this does a good job of showing that movement of information from the bottom of the slide, concerns, opportunities, and priorities, coming forward through our producers, partners, and our stakeholders in the community, to the local working group and the local staff. So this is that formal process that impacts on the right side local decisions, but then it also moves up to the State Technical Advisory Committee and up to state conservationists for impacting state level decisions. So moving up through the red lines is kind of that formal process, but then we also know, as you heard from Troy and others, that sometimes information comes from other mechanisms, not just the local working group process, from your MASWCD meetings, your employee association meetings, from just interactions with NRCS staff and partners. And all of that information helps to kind of funnel its way up to state level decisions and the impacts of what we should be doing to best address local needs. So local working group impacts on NRCS programs, it obviously plays a big factor into our screening and ranking. And now with our new conservation assessment ranking tool, CART, we are plugging percentages in for these resource concerns and the resource concern categories right into the tool. And it also impacts plan practices and impacts. So if we're prioritizing, this is the screen at the bottom, you can see the priorities for all of Minnesota for cropland. The highest priority last year was soil erosion, sheet and rail erosion. So if that's our highest priority on cropland, we are wanting in Minnesota ranking pools for our programs to prioritize that, give that the most points, give that the highest percentage, and also establish ranking questions that are going to address those highest needs. So this is to mirror the summary of our local working group priorities when we move this stuff forward. And as you heard from Troy Daniel, he takes this very seriously. We are wanting to make sure that this is directly tied back to the local needs. So that's been of great value towards finding the impacts and value of the locally led process. And one other thing that I threw in there today was just to make you aware of, are we speaking the same language? There's a lot of plans, there's a lot of other resources out there. We have our specific resource concerns and categories. It can be daunting and overwhelming, 47 of them. But the example of soil erosion, when I say, let's address soil erosion, what do you envision in your mind? Is it this? Wind blowing, wind erosion blowing? It could be, depending on where you are in the state and what you've experienced. Or is it this? This is also soil erosion, gully erosion from water. Or is it this? Bank erosion. And so this is kind of that speaking the same language, are we on the same page? Making that connection between our existing plans, whether it's a water plan, a one watershed, one plan, but knowing that if we're on the same page, if we're focused on these efforts, there's going to be different practices that address each one of these. So that's part of the reason why NRCS is pretty specific on our resource concerns and needs, because we are really trying to target it down to, addressing wind erosion would be completely different than trying to address stream bank erosion. And then trying to find value was another big part of, or not find value, but share the value of local working groups and the impact. So one of the things that we also do with the State Technical Advisory Committee is look at what our priorities were and then what our top practices were. So on the screen here in the top is 2020, what the top 10 practices by dollars were for our EQIP program. So this is just a snapshot of one of our programs, the top 10, and you can see that we spent about 70% of our funding on those top 10 practices across the state of Minnesota. So this is information that could be shared locally based on your local results. What was done, where the dollars went, what was targeted, and did it align with the bottom of the slide, which was, our locally led values. So, this was an example of one of our local working group teams from last year where they had prioritized similarly soil erosion wind was their top priority. So that's part of that evaluation, trying to determine if we did hit the mark. So we have a quick quiz here. And Lisa's going to help me. You can see it on your screen. The question is, what % of Minnesota environmental quality EQIP funds and CSP, conservation stewardship, general funds were placed in area or lower level pools in 2018? So this is in 2018. So that's not on the slide on the screen that you're seeing the pop-up, but it's on my slide. So this is for 2018. So that's only 3 years ago, if my math is correct. So what percent of those program funds were in the area level, an NRCS area, or lower down to a county or a team level funding pool?
I can see they're thinking it over, Keith, and now they're
All right.
rolling in. Here we go.
All right, so people said 64% was the leader there. Some said 80, some said 33. On my screen, you can see the answer is 0%. So in 2018, we kept all money at the state level. We had all state level pools. CSP, we had some regional pools. They weren't based on areas. They were just based on kind of eco-regions. And all the EQIP pools in 2018 were at the state level. So we were compiling all the local resource concerns from all the counties and then using those to evaluate those state level pools. Now, next question, follow up. So this one's for 2021. There's 2 questions because they're a little different, but on my slide, you can see this is for this year, and some of it's changing a little bit because of program changes, but what percent of Minnesota EQIP funds will or have been placed in area or lower funding pools? And then the second question is, what percent of CSP general funds have or will be placed in area level or lower funding pools?
All right, they're weighing in.
They
The
are.
votes are rolling in. We're going to do this pretty quickly, so if you're thinking about it, just
Yep.
no shame about right or wrong answers. Just keep moving and thinking about it. And we're getting a little bit of
All
a
right.
pause, so I'm
Yep.
going to end the polling. 3, 2, 1, and here we go.
57% and 63%. So 57 on EQIP, and the answer on my screen is EQIP. Currently, we were targeting 72% and at 14.4 million. And then CSP, we have 100% now at our area levels. So we moved everything to area level funding pools for better alignment with the local needs of those areas. We haven't gone any lower in CSP just because of the issues with the amount of money we have. So in summary, I just want to close out by saying locally led really influences much more than NRCS program delivery. As we discussed, it informs partners at all levels, and it's more than that local working group. It's that continual cycle, working through starting and ending with that local working group, but all those steps in between is that continual process. And it's really key to ensuring that local needs are identified and then addressed through all levels of conservation, locally, area, state level. So we wanted to quickly touch on resource concern priorities on the Minnesota website. So Lisa, I think, is going to share her screen. I just wanted to show you, this is building off of last year's local work groups. We will share this link, but on our site, we have our 2020 locally led conservation. We have our map of Minnesota. And if Lisa clicks on the Baxter team, for example, this brings up, it takes you into another map. She'll have to click on, I guess, Baxter again, and then it'll bring up a link to the Baxter Service Center team that services that whole conservation customer service team, and it identifies their priority resource concerns for cropland, pasture land, in order, and forest land. And so with our funding this year, this is the information that we are aligning with for these local funding pools. And this is out there for the public partners to see, but then also something that we directly require them to utilize when developing their priorities for their local funding pools. So we'll be doing this yearly, updating this so that it's out there for everyone to see and for our staff to fully link to and align with as they go forward with developing their conservation programs and outreach. So thank you for sticking with me through that. We tried to touch on a lot of the basics and background, and now it's my honor to turn it over to Molly Voller. She's our public affairs specialist with NRCS. So thank you, Molly. The floor is yours.
I am Molly Voller. I am your state public affairs specialist for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Minnesota. We are going to discuss engaging a broader public. as you all know, that the former U.S. Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, said all politics is local politics. Well, all conservation is local conservation. Coming from NRCS, I know lots of people think NRCS gets all of our money from the top down, but as you've just seen from Keith, we're trying to make that much, much more local. So since our conservation is local, we also need to think about the community we are serving. And how diverse is your community? It might be more varied than you think. And I had to think, if I was trying to find a more diverse group of people, where would I go? NASS, the United States National Agricultural Statistics Service. That's where you should go. Why NASS? Well, NASS is about farmers by farmers. In Minnesota, NASS can have the data like farms with Asian producers, 336, with a value of $64,000. That's nothing to shake a stick at. And farmers with Hispanic producers, 583 or thereabout, with a value of $211 million. There's a lot out there. NASS has been around for a while, since 1863. They know what they are doing. Now, I compare NASS and finding people in your local community not unlike online dating. Now, I myself have not online dated, and I'm looking at some of you. You look like maybe you have or have not online dated. My husband and my boyfriend don't want me to online date, so I'm not. I respect their wishes on that. Anybody? I made a joke. My husband and my boyfriend don't want me to do online dating? Oh, you're not paying attention. All right, but if I was going to online date, I would want the best online dating service. So the best online dating service for me might be Match.com or Farmers Only, but the best online dating service for you to find people to come to your meetings is probably NASS. Here's an example. Online dating, you have a profile, single white female, red hair, 5'4". Do I sound good to you yet? Let's look at the Blue Earth County profile. The Blue Earth County profile shows, if you dig into it, how many producers, how many are male and female, what the different races are, although we're really all the human race. I'd like to point that out. And then at the very bottom there, would you have guessed that in Blue Earth, 336 of those landowners and farmers qualify as and identify as new and beginning farmers? I would not have known or thought that. You're probably thinking, where did she get this phenomenal information? Where do I find this for my own county? Well, one week I found it, and the next week I went in to look for it, and I couldn't find it. So I dug and dug. I spent more than an hour clicking online, and I'm sure all of you love to just click randomly trying to find information you know was there. After I found it, I decided I needed to give you instructions so you could find it more easily. Here we go. You get into NASS, and there's that link for you right there. And then you look at the state and county profiles. Click on Minnesota. After that, it doesn't make sense to me necessarily. It says, but there on the top line, state and county reports, and then it says county profiles. Remember, you are online dating. You want their profile. You don't want their report. You want their profile. So click on the state and county profiles. Keep going. Bingo, you got it. This time I went to Polk County. I got bored with who I was finding in Blue Earth. There weren't enough wealthy widowed men with beautiful red barns to support my likes. So I went up to Polk County. There's the top page, or at the top of the page you see is the first page, and the second page at the very bottom is the information I'm looking for. Total producers, about 2,000. Around 1,500 are male and about 500 are female. Did you think they had 500 female producers in Polk County? I was surprised to see that around 15 identify themselves as Asian. Really surprised to see one producer identify themselves as Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. I say we reach out to this person in January and February, see how they're doing. If they've really come from the islands, January and February up there in Polk County might be a little tough. And again, down there at the bottom, new and beginning farmers, 422 of the 2,000 producers consider themselves new and beginning. Now you know who's in your county. Now, how are you going to reach these people? This is still important to keep looking at this slide. Percent of farms that have internet access. Wow, 76. That's okay, but not great, only 76. So how are you going to find these folks? Well, let's go to our media. We're going to use the internet, television, radio, newspapers, and magazines. Let's get more specific. You need a little more help than that. Phone a friend. I'm giving you some help. This is me. This is me on my new office phone. We have a new open air system. We thought it would be better to fight against COVID and any other germs to just get rid of all the walls. I have a lot of quarters on hand. So if you leave me a message, I'll call you back. But when you hear the operator go, another quarter, please, you're going to hear me popping my quarters in. All right, here's your recruitment tips. Here's what you need to know. Number one, identify the representation that's missing in your committee, in your meeting. Check, you already have done that. You know how to get to NAS. Number two, this is important. Just like online dating, when you need to write who you are and what you're searching for, okay, you need to write single attractive male, okay? Searching for, I'm going to make some assumptions here, female for going to the movies and sharing popcorn. No long-term relationship. You have to identify what you're looking for. And then you have to say what's in it for them. Movie tickets and popcorn on me, right? You got to make it worth your while. So write a statement of who you are looking for, why you need their representation, and what's in it for them. Movie and popcorn on me. Now open your mind a little bit. Maybe you're only looking in your church and your school and your community. Maybe it's time to open and look a little further out. Find those community leaders of the underrepresented people, the folks who aren't coming to your meeting. Do you have people in those age brackets that are identified in NAS coming to your meeting? Or are you all 64 and older? Because there's a lot of farmers between 35 and 64, the middle-aged farmers, right? Now we need to use some non-traditional to us, because you and I use all the same type of networking. Let's try some other networking. Some foreign language press, some different places of worship, some different newsletters. I produce a newsletter every month. I got to say, if you give me something to put in that newsletter, I am going to use it. And I know that your local newsletters are the same way. Sometimes you just need to go to your local farmers markets and see who's selling there. I know a lot of what NRCS serves are big farms that aren't selling at the farmers market. Maybe we need to get some of those farmers market farmers in too. This number 6. This is important. Keep inviting your new recruits to come back. Here's why I say that. It takes at least 5 or 6 dates for a person to feel like they're in a relationship. So back to online dating, you go out with somebody once, then you're waiting for them to call you back. You need to invite this person at least 5 or 6 times out to go with you or to come to your meeting before they're going to feel like they're in a relationship and before they're going to feel like they can come to this meeting without personally being invited. I know that's a lot of work, but I'm looking at your faces and I know that all of you know how to go courting. You know how to court somebody. You need to court people to come to your meetings. Here's our spring and summary. Diversity is good. Your meeting will be enhanced by it, or at least you won't have to see the same faces of the same people. Tell me you are not bored of seeing the same people. Find out who is in your community. Look at NAS. Reach all aspects of your community. Try some different media. Have you advertised on the local rock station? Have you advertised on the country music station? Maybe you should try that. They're looking for people to advertise, or at least come and talk. And finally, keep inviting your new recruits. Remember that rule? You got to go on 5 or 6 dates. You got to invite these people at least 5 or 6 times and get them to show up before they feel like they're a part of this. I want you to take home, I want you to think about your story. What does your board look like? Who comes to your local work group meetings? who else can you invite? And if you have been successful at getting a broader audience to your meetings, share with others how you do that. It was truly a pleasure to see all of you today. I hope that if you go online dating, that you go to Farmers Only. I am not out there. My husband and my boyfriend don't want me to do that. But I do hope that you bring in some more people to come to your meetings.
Thank you so much, Molly. And I saw you had some love for your office in the chat, as well as made people smile about the husband and the boyfriend. So there may be some follow-ups with that. We are now going to engage in one final conversation. And this is more about the role that each of you can play with the locally led. And to lead us in this conversation, we have Paul Krabenhoff, Clay SWCD, and president of our state board. And I'm unsure in his courting to that role as state president if they mentioned the pandemic for the year, but Paul has been very positive and productive. So with that, to talk about the role of elected leaders and staff, Leanne Buck and Paul Krabenhoff.
And as I said before, I get to work with a tremendous number of soil and water district supervisors from around the state. So at this time, we're going to just do kind of an exchange of that local soil and water district perspective. So Paul, I know you're still on mute there, but I just want to start it off as whether it's your local district or it's your one watershed, one plan, or the local working group process for identifying those resource priorities, how do you view your role as the elected soil and water district supervisor for that process?
Well, first of all, if I may say, it's good to be here today, and I'm glad we have so many supervisors on. It's really important. I think I've got an easier part here, following up with what's already been said. And I'm going to go back to something that Donna Ray brought right away at the very beginning, and that was about the marble cake. And when I look at how we work now, you know, in the local working group, on to now mixing into potentially one watershed, one plan, depending on how your district's doing. Are you in the planning or implementation stage? These conversations that we're having, and you're asking me how as a supervisor do we get engaged and involved, but these conversations, in my view, should be happening already at your board. This should be full. I feel as an elected supervisor, I want to know what little deeper detail what's going on with my board. I want to know how my staff is engaging. I want to get to know NRCS. I want to know my BC. And from all these people I learn, and from all these people I'm able to have a conversation with, and from there, I'm better equipped to for the outreach into my community. Whether it's here, I can tell you I'm not a farmer. I used to be. 1990 was my last year. So I've lived in the city of Moorhead for 30 years, and I've sold real estate. But why am I still in soil and water? Well, the simple fact is I still believe in what it does for our state, the stewardship of the land and the water. And so bringing forward, I guess I see it as community engagement of bringing out what we do, learning what we do, so that I can follow along and be aware of what these priorities are by that engagement, and knowing it's a good thing, and it's efficient, it's productive, and I can be a player in it, whether it's locally by just my own experience, others, or by conversations with others that are in the farm, or on the dairy, or in the woods. You know, what's best for them, hearing that feedback, and then be able to carry that message on to our state legislature for backing of the programs and and money that we need to operate and exist.
Thank you, Paul. Another question too, and there's a saying, leaders think and talk about the solutions. Followers think and talk about problems. So as we're looking at identifying resource concerns, the biggest effort that we're trying to do here is look at how do we, as a soil and water district, what is our role for those solutions? So question for you is, do you have any examples of how you set up your board meetings or how you actually, bring about or invite people to your local working group meetings? So how do you work with your district manager to encourage big picture governance and articulating resource priorities and concerns? What are those real life examples you can share?
Yeah, I think that happens in a couple ways. Can I say it best, not to get too particular because we're at a broad audience here, but at best, I feel like the local working group really should be of an extension of what is happening day to day. And we know what each other are doing, whether it's NRCS or the local district. And then it's that opportunity, I guess, to help the state and help the feds, mark those priorities down. And, it was interesting when I looked at the one regional one that came back. Now, all of a sudden, there's a connectedness with not only my local clay SWCD, but what about the other 4 around me that districts that I work with from time to time. And so tying that together along with, Bowser and other things. You're asking for a specific, I can think of one thing that every year, and I think this has to do with when we're working with our BC and we're working on our, the use of capacity funds. But, we really do break it down to what grants do we have coming our way that we've been working on, this ongoing process. You see the areas that we are working, and then it's a conversation with our specific staff. How, what do you see each person doing throughout the year to build this priority? I know sometimes, I thought about the soil erosion that Keith brought about, wind, gully, and stream bank. Well, I can, many years ago, we sold trees, and that had to do with wind. And I assure you, the dirt was blowing only 2 days ago when the wind was 60 miles an hour around. So we have that need. You don't have it up north in the trees, but we sure have it here in the valley. So I know we've always, for us, locally, we built our district around trees and the maintenance and management of trees, no-till, other type of soil erosion practices. And then when it comes down to stream bank erosion, there's a lot of fall in our from east to west, from the hills to the Red River Valley. And then we've had major projects along the river. We can point those out, we can find our partners easily, and this process helps lead us to where can we find that money to engage and be able to implement those practices.
And last but not least, Paul, is what advice do you have for SWCD board members when enhancing their leadership roles to advance conservation priorities?
Well, all I can say is get involved. It's been, I can just tell you, it's been one of the most gratifying and rewarding things I've had throughout my life. I'm in the 3%. I thought that poll was very interesting. And, but you know what? At the same time, I'm really, really encouraged by the fact that how many newer supervisors are out there, as well as I'll call them, the ones that were 6 to 12 years. I can't quite remember how that was broke down, but anyway, it's the map out there is, and the projects is continually changing. Our funding process are continually changing. But for me, as an elected person, it's been a privilege to be able to have outreach, have more community involvement, getting to know my commissioners, getting to know my city leaders, and salt and waters for the rural area and the urban. So, engaging that, the educational piece, learning about water systems and getting out to our schools, the work that we do. And this is for the here and now, but it's also for the future. And if we engage in through any vehicle that I guess we feel comfortable with, I say go for it.
So thank you, and we'll turn away to Donna Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne and Paul. And we are wanting to conclude this seminar just with something too I've heard from Leanne Buck, which is we all want to see how we're part of a winning team for natural resources. And so we've got a few slides to go over quickly here as we enter into our last section of this program. So take it away, Leanne.
So again, earlier this year, we did a survey to both supervisors and staff, and that had comments about how does the local work group make a difference? So here's just a few slides to share with you that the bigger impact that we might not see collectively with our individual districts. Next. One of the things that we want to talk about is economic impacts. And so a great example for salt and water districts right now, currently for the last 6 or 7 years, we've had about 3 different rounds of the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. That's a simple example of how the CRP program has leveraged the RIM Reserve Program, a state-funded thing that is the last round, I believe we're around $300 and some million in the state of Minnesota for conservation activities. Next. So here's an example. In 2016, we worked with our association and Bowser and NRCS. NRCS had done a regular ongoing process of their economic assessment. And we had the opportunity to join NRCS to look at all 3 of our organizations. And that included the Board of Water and Soil Resources, Soil and Water Districts, as well as USDA, including NRCS and Farm Service Agency. And so this just gives you an example of the jobs supported. And I just wanted to provide the context. So when you looked in 2016 of all the funds spent in Minnesota, this is just Minnesota only, approximately $135 million for NRCS. Then you take into consideration the Farm Service Agency with the Conservation Reserve Program, which many of you are familiar with, was $114 million. Bowser, the bulk of their dollars that go out is to local governments, but for the state of Minnesota, some of those natural resources block grant, Jeff Nielsen would know what I'm talking about, is Wetland Conservation Act, feedlot, et cetera. That was around $5.9 million. But the dollars that flowed through from Bowser to the Soil and Water Districts was approximately almost $50 million of funds spent. But what that also leveraged was total jobs. If you look at it collectively, we were about $305 million in the state of Minnesota between our federal and state and local partnership. Next. So that's one way of looking at it, but the other way we wanted to do with this next slide is to show you it in a graph. So if you collectively look, the blue is what you're influencing. The local working group process is reflective, you could say, in the blue and also in that orange. But then for the soil and water districts, again, those funds are about, at that time, it was about 19%. NRCS was about 55%. And the Farm Service Agency, when you looked at those payments, that made up about 22%. So again, collectively, we're all in this together. Next. There we go. So what we're also talking about is this is also just not an economic for jobs and the local conservation resource professionals, but it brings into that local conservation work. Through your conservation efforts, this is what maybe your county commissioners might want to hear. If it's not about the natural resources, they're going to want to think about how did this generate the economic value? How did it add value to the economy? We hired contractors, there were seeding companies, there was seeding items. So again, there's multiple ways of looking at the economy. And again, for soil and water districts, it added a value of $68 million to the state. This is a one snapshot in time. But again, you can look at how the CRP payments and the NRCS, and again, the state of Minnesota. Collectively, we all have a piece, and you're having an influence when you think about your local resource concerns, where that money goes, and what are those priorities. They do have an economic benefit to the communities. Next. And this one thing too is, I guess I want you to pay particular attention to that right-hand column. Again, these are the same numbers that we looked at in 2016. It was the funds spent, there was the value added. And the last is looking at the multipliers. So for soil and water districts, if you look at the 1.4, the multiplier, for every dollar spent, there was an additional 40% or 40 cents added, again, to that value added of conservation. So what we're saying is collectively, the expenditures and the resources in the state and federal investments and local investments that went into your communities had for every dollar, there was another 35 cents of added value to the communities for those conservation efforts. So again, what you're looking at, how you're identifying those resources isn't just identifying who gets some of those projects or what type of practices are utilized through this federal and local system, but you have input into a major economic driver and some of the local economies when it comes to not only the value of natural resources, but how it works in your community. So again, what I'm thinking about at the end of the day, just to transition, what you do matters. And as I want to make some closing remarks, I was thinking about it. And one of the things I think about is growing up in a small community. And maybe many of you can think about the communities that you were raised in, whether it was a suburb, a city, a town. Maybe you're thinking about even your community could have been your college or your formative years anyway. And one of the things I was thinking about is I could list off the leaders in my community. It was Mr. and Mrs. Marbin. It was the Petersons. It was the Vickermans. It was the Ludermans. And we paid attention, even though as a young person, as a 17-year-old, I didn't know exactly what the meetings, what they were going to, or how they particularly looked at the community. But what I knew was the way they communicated, the way they talked, the way they were involved, they were definitely community leaders. And I was paying attention. And so the thought process I just want to share with you, if you think about yourself now as a community leader, people are paying attention to what you're saying, what you're using, how you're communicating, who you're bringing to the table, and how you engage that and how you share those things. Your local work group might be citizens, but it also might be that DNR hydrologist. It might be the Fish and Wildlife Service employee. It may be a county commissioner. It may be a township official. And again, all of those individuals are looking to you as leaders for this resource management and resource concerns. And again, I want to engage you and think about your important role. And at the end of the day, I just really, really want to say thank you for your contributions to this organization, your contributions to the economics of your efforts, as well as obviously the natural resources and the soil health that you provide to so many of our citizens across the state of Minnesota. So with that, I will turn it over. And again, I just want to say thank you.
All right, thank you, Leanne. And we are bumping up against the time. So in closing, I just wanted to also echo what Leanne said and thank you for the time today, the time throughout the year that you do as SWCD supervisors and partners, that you provide the assistance to us in conservation delivery and these locally led efforts. And just leave you with the last session we had with our staff and partners, I challenged them to challenge each other. We gave them a lot of information over 4 weeks. Leanne mentioned some of the things of engaging partners, ways to be more interactive with participants, additional outreach. You heard from Molly and others today on other opportunities to improve your locally led efforts. So I'm hoping that this training series will lead staff and also you as supervisors to look at ways to improve that process, more engaging, more insightful, more meaningful, more impactful. And so I challenged everyone last session. I challenge you today to at least adopt one thing new, try to, make some improvement, whether it's completing that locally led conservation cycle, different engagement opportunities, but whatever it is, try to make it better on your end. We hope that there's been some value to what you've seen today. We have a quick poll that we're going to pop up on the screen in closing. So question 1, did something about locally led conservation become clear to you today? Yes or no? And the second question is, will this information help you enhance your role, either not at all, somewhat, a great deal, or a lot? And with that, thank you all again. We appreciate the time and attendance and everything you do, and we will close this out. You can stay on and look for the poll results if you want. Otherwise, you can leave the meeting whenever you are done. Thank you.